notice for supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
Our central offer for those who support the show is a sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends of Always Take Notes. Now greatly expanded, the package runs to more than 100 pages.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document, so if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address, so no one is breaking confidences by contributing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the author and lawyer Philippe Sands.
We spoke to Philippe about combining international law and writing, about his prize-winning book East-West Street, which blended memoir and history, and about representing and writing about the Chagos Islanders.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Philippe, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with your latest book, The Last Colony? Can you tell us a little bit about the case and the lectures that gave rise to this book?
Sure. Well, first off, it's really nice to join you. Thank you so much for asking me. So The Last Colony is a slightly different thing. It's a sort of blend of my two different lives. My work as a barrister. I've been counsel for Mauritius for 15 years now on an effort that country has had to recover a group of islands known as the Chagos Archipelago in the Indian Ocean that was severed from Mauritius just before it got independence. And that case I have litigated successfully on behalf of Mauritius. The International Court of Justice in The Hague has ruled that the United Kingdom illegally severed the islands and that they remain part of Mauritius. And the decision to write a book, which came immediately after the decision of the International Court of Justice, was really to get the issue to a bigger audience, recognizing that lawyers and politicians and diplomats alone were not going to be sufficient. We needed to find a way to reach out. And with the impact of my earlier books, East-West Street and The Rat Line, I came to understand that writing sort of literary type nonfiction was a way to reach a bigger audience.
And are there particular issues you have to be aware of when you're writing a book based on a legal case that you've been involved in as a lawyer? Are there issues of confidentiality or conflict of interest or anything like that you have to steer in between?
Absolutely. It's very, very delicate. The first thing is I, the writer, am not independent. And so you have to be very upfront about that straight away. And I start that in the note to the reader that I have a very partial view of the whole story. I do my best to distance myself, but the reader must understand I've got, skin in the game. I'm part of the story. And that I think you just have to be very, very honest and straight about. And the second aspect, of course, is that you are privy to information which is not in the public domain. And so you need support, authorization. In my case, I had to go to the government of Mauritius and say, look, I'm thinking of writing a book. And of course, from their perspective, it was useful because it was a way of promoting the story and a particular perspective. They didn't ask to read a draft or have any input, but I suspect there is always a degree of self-censorship in what you write when you're writing a story that you have in some way been involved in. So yes, it is indeed very, very delicate. It also means that in relation to the people who are on the other side of the case, in this case, the government of the United Kingdom, I think you have a particular responsibility to be courteous and careful and accurate, because if you don't, they're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Do you have fact-checking help and all of that stuff in the writing and editorial process?
You would be astonished as to how I write. I am a one-finger typist. I type all my own stuff, but I do have the benefit of incredible research assistants who help me gather the material, review drafts. Some of the lawyers who were juniors in the case review text for accuracy and so on and so forth. So basically, the first draft is pretty much all me. And then when I need a sort of reality check, have I got the tone right? Have I been fair? Have I been balanced? Have I put the other side's case in a decent way? Is the writing style accessible for non-lawyers? That's very, very important to me. I have a range of different people I go to who will review and everything from my wife, who's my most attentive reader. She comes from a very literary family. Her father was an editor, her grandfather was an editor, and to barristers and just friends who I'll just share stuff with.
And do you feel, having embarked on this with an idea that you were going to bring the issue to a broader audience, that has been achieved? Do you think there has been kind of movement on, if in the court of public opinion, if not in the courts of law, as a function of the book?
I mean, there's no question that the number of people who know about the Chagos story has just grown dramatically. I mean, when the Prime Minister of Mauritius got in touch with me in April 2010, I, to be very frank, had never even heard of Chagos. I didn't know where it was. I didn't know what the story was. I was pretty horrified with myself for not knowing about it. The decision of the International Court of Justice was February 2019. I published the book in September 2022. By that point, the British government had basically adopted the position we're going to ignore the decision of the International Court of Justice. 2 months later, in November 22, in other words, just about 8 weeks after publication of the book, the government completely changed its position and started negotiations with Mauritius, which are now underway and which I'm feeling reasonably optimistic about. I would be thrilled to say to you that the publication of the book changed the position adopted by the British government, but that is not the case. The Prime Minister at the time, in her 49-day tenure, was Liz Truss. She had been Foreign Secretary, and she had come to recognize that in relation to Ukraine, it was not attractive to be reaching out to countries, particularly from Africa, asking for assistance to respond to Russia's illegal occupation of Ukraine if the United Kingdom was illegally occupying a part of Africa. And I think that is what really caused the change. But some people say, it's sort of embarrassing to read it. The book made it onto the Sunday Times bestseller list, and so it got a lot of attention. Not as much, interestingly, as I've come to understand, when you write books about Nazis, then everyone gets attention. But when you write a book about British colonial history, the audience is undoubtedly smaller, but it's a significant audience. And it is sort of people who think and people who contribute, and perhaps unwittingly, it had an impact. It's very difficult to measure.
You mentioned the importance of accessibility in terms of writing, but perhaps using this book as a test case, how did you go about making legal issues and history that people might not be familiar with, accessible and familiar to readers?
Well, that's really the beating heart of my writing, in a sense. I've always loved what I do. I've been very fortunate as an academic at UCL and other places, teaching about things that I really care about and doing cases about things that are interesting that I care about. But I'd come to understand that both in the academic community and the lawyer community, we're sort of in a ghetto. We sort of, speak to ourselves. And you'd go to dinner parties or meet people, and they'd sort of ask you what you do. And if you say, you're a lawyer or a barrister, it's actually a bit of a killer. The people are not so thrilled. And then you say, well, actually, I do cases about environmental despoliation or mass murder or genocide. And all of a sudden, people are really interested and they want to hear the stories. But the catalytic moment, it's very, very clear for me, was Iraq. It was the war in Iraq, the decision to invade Iraq. And in particular, I was one amongst a group of colleagues and friends who really led the charge on the illegality of the war. And we came to understand that there's a lot of people out there who are really interested in these areas, and they're smart and they're able to digest complex arguments and complex issues, but they want it presented in a way that's not turgid and that's not technical. And so the challenge for me has been to take that material and present it in a way that basically my mother could read it and think, yeah, I can, she's a big reader of books, but she doesn't want to read a law textbook. And so I've been assisted by a significant number of people in doing that. I think one of the things I've been very fortunate about is because my cases are before international courts, you don't stand up before a panel of, one or three English judges. You appear before a group of 15 judges. They come from different countries, different cultures, different backgrounds, all really interesting, highly intelligent, educated individuals. But you've got to make your arguments in a way that everyone can understand. And it's not a sort of lowest common denominator, but it does mean you've got to present things that can be heard and understood by an Australian, a Mexican, someone from South Africa, someone from Russia, in a way that is a powerful narrative. So that was, I realize now, 20 years of doing that had enabled me, if you like, to move quite far in accessibility. But the real change, the real incredible piece of good fortune that I had was that my next door neighbor for 20 years was John le Carre. And we sort of bonded over Iraq, actually in the local pub. And he would he would ask me to review all of his manuscripts. For 20 years, I did that. There was always, in every John le Carre novel, an appalling lawyer. And my job was to check the awfulness of the lawyer. Was the lawyer, did the lawyer speak like a lawyer? Did they dress like a lawyer? So on and so forth. And so I came to read all of his manuscripts, and he, on the converse, he really was interested in things like Iraq and Guantanamo and the kinds of things I was doing. And I'd have to explain them to him in ways that he could understand. He's obviously a very smart guy. And we came to explore the parallels between his world of espionage and my world of law, and his world of writing and my world of advocacy. And we understood there was a point of commonality, and it was this. When he's writing his books, as he explained to me, he came to understand that his readers are very intelligent. They're smart. They're one step ahead of the game, trying to work out where he's taking them before the big reveals come. And I would say to him, it's exactly the same when you're at the International Court of Justice. You never say to the judges, this is what you must do. This is what this means. You present the material and you want them to come to the conclusion that you would like them to come to, but leaving them feeling they've cracked it. They've taken that direction. And we had the most wonderful conversations about the parallels of our lives as a lawyer, as an advocate, and as a writer. And I think that really did help me write a lot. There are all sorts of tricks that I've completely nicked from him. He would tell me how he would put tiny little points of detail right in the first pages of the book, because he'd come to understand that his readers, who were very loyal, knew that every word was there for a reason. And if he's put some obscure, ridiculous fact in, it's there for a reason, or it could be there for a reason. And I do exactly the same thing. And that is the technique that causes smart people to read on. They know that it's there, and they want to beat you to the conclusion.
Could we roll back now right to the kind of beginning of your life? And did you always want to be a lawyer on the one hand, and was there also always a parallel interest in writing from an early age?
I had no idea what I wanted to be, had no idea that I was interested in writing, was not a big reader as a kid. I think everything changed in university years. Actually, I had one fantastic teacher at school, sort of economics and politics teacher, a man called Edmund Burke, who was from Yorkshire, who really opened up the world to us and made us think. Was the first person who really made me think. in a sort of more rigorous way. And then at university, just the cast of characters I was around, in particular, my then girlfriend, who was a very literary type of person, just opened me into a different world. And also, actually, I think probably theatre at university and people who were interested in literature, but just the world expanded. And I think everything changed in that period. But I know I fell into law by accident, and I fell into writing by accident at a dinner party when I went to a dinner with my wife, and there was someone at the dinner who was an editor at Penguin, and who it's time of Iraq, and said, "Wow, that's actually quite interesting. Can you send me a 10-page proposal? And if you can write, I'll give you a contract, and you can write a book about international law." It's a book that was called Lawless World. Different style from the more recent books, because I had real trouble finding my voice. But yeah, it was, I think probably the 10 pages, I spent so much time writing those 10 pages, but it did the trick. I didn't have an agent or anything. And I was unbelievably thrilled to be paid an advance of £4,000, because I'd written a lot of academic books before then. And, if they sold 9 copies and I made £23 in total, that would be miraculous. So that was the moment of change.
With those early academic books, had you written proposals for those? I mean, how does it work when you're writing a book for that audience?
Yeah, I mean, books for Manchester. My first academic book was, for what's now part of Cambridge University Press. And then my main big book on international environmental law was for Manchester University Press. And you have to write a proposal, and it goes through the board of, regents or whatever. And they decide if they're going to give you a contract. And you write it, you're pretty much on your own, and there's really not much editing. And what emerges at the end is essentially unedited. So it was a bit of a miracle to come across Penguin and meet this person called an editor who actually had views about what you were writing: structure, tone, content, length, substance, everything. And I have loved that. I've loved working with editors. It's been a real joy. And it's one of the things actually that I think is a real error in the academic world, is no one teaches you how to write. I never took a course on writing at university or at any point ever. Although my teachers as barristers, you do something called pupillage and you're a student barrister. I had terrific teachers. One of whom, Barbara Doman, who actually German and became an English barrister, very literary person. And we got on terribly. She was horrible to work with, but I realize now I learned so much, and I'm so grateful to her for her rigor in writing. It's really interesting how you pick up your writing style and where you get it from. It's unexpected.
With Lawless World in 2005, what was the reaction like? And in particular, is it right that at that time both you and Cherie Blair were at Matrix? And how did that play by the water cooler?
Very tense. So, I mean, we had founded Matrix together. We'd actually founded it in Tony Blair's office at 10 Downing Street. A little group of us came together. So it was sort of, a cozy situation. And then we just parted ways over Iraq, and the rupture was never healed. And I mean, one of the things as a litigator, certainly for me, I'm always the one on the team who loves to deal with the facts and find the real story of what happened and get the evidence. And in Lawless World, the central issue, I mean, it deals with more than just Iraq, but the central issue was Iraq. And in that book, I uncovered the secret advice that Lord Goldsmith had given Tony Blair, that the war was illegal. And so when the book came out, it caused a lot of waves. It sold many, many copies. Not huge in sort of relative terms, but for me it was huge. And it got a lot of attention, and that opened the door to writing other types of books. And I loved it, actually. And what I loved was the fact that regular folk out there who are smart and readers are interested in the kind of stuff I'm interested in, if you can present it in a way that is accessible and fair and balanced. They don't want your views imposed on them. But but that was the sort of magical moment, understanding, the decency and smartness of people out there. It's fascinating to connect with readers, which you don't do as an academic.
Once you'd had that sort of approach or overture at the dinner party, how long did it take you from then to actually publishing the book? What was the kind of research and writing process like?
I think the dinner party would have been in late 2003. It was Margaret Blumen, who was an editor at Penguin, and I sat next to her, and I'm just eternally grateful to her because she sort of changed my life by opening that door. And the book came out in, I think, April 2005. So it was pretty quick. I mean, it was a quick write for me compared to the books that have come later because it was very familiar territory. I was writing about the law. It is sort of a law book, but for a bigger audience. And so it took me just over a year to write it. And as you know, the publishing, which I wasn't aware of, but the publishing in the trade publication, it's a pretty slow process. It's 7 or 8 months by the time you hand in the manuscript and it's copy edited and proofs and so on and so forth. So it was just over a year, I think, which is for me very fast.
Could we turn now to East West Street, and particularly the kind of timescale of that project? Because is it right that the point of departure was October 2010 when you were invited to Lviv to give this lecture? Tell us about how that came to be, and then the extended gestation of that book.
I mean, these things happen in unexpected. I mean, one thing leads to another. You open a door, and then there's a space, and then there's more doors. And East West Street would never have happened but for Lawless World. There was another book in between called Torture Team, which was about Guantanamo and the Bush administration lawyers, which was still in a legal voice, and published by Penguin. That came out in 2008. And that was beginning to get me a broader audience, certainly not a massive audience, but a broader audience. And that meant I would be getting more invitations. And in particular, people outside in the world sort of like an independent, spirited academic or barrister who isn't scared to take on their own government or the American government. And so I would get more and more invitations. And one of the invitations that I got was to attend Davos, the World Economic Forum, which actually I'm not partial to and don't like at all. But there I met a Ukrainian woman who said she was from a place called Lviv, which I had never heard of. This was about January 2010, whenever Davos is. And we got talking, and then I realized Lviv was Lemberg. And Lemberg I had heard of because my grandfather was born in Lemberg. And she said, would you like to come? And I said, God, I'd love to come. Is it safe? Can you go there? And so she said, yes, I'll send you an invitation. I'll get university to invite you. And so they invited me to give a lecture on the cases I was then doing on crimes against humanity and genocide. This sort of Rwanda, Yugoslavia type things. And that was set for October 2010. And of course, because it was where my grandfather was from, I was very close to my grandfather. I loved him hugely. I, of course, wanted to ask my mum, and basically to protect me against my mum, I wanted to invite my aunt, and to protect me against my aunt, I needed to invite my son, who's 15. And so we all toddled off to Lviv, and I gave this lecture. And it was a complete accident. I can't claim any credit for having, had an intuition or anything. I just discovered, literally unbelievably, as the Carrie would say, and Anthony Beaver, that the inventors of both concepts, crimes against humanity and genocide, came from the city of Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov, whatever you want to call it. And so I didn't go there intending to write a book. And in fact, when I left, what then happened was Penguin, Margaret had retired, and I was passed on to a new and very excellent editor, Stuart Profit. And he said, so what do you want to do next? Let's have lunch. And it was about January 2011. And I had 5 different ideas, 4 of which concerned cases I was doing or things that I was doing in my professional life. And the 5th one was what became East West Street. And he said, that's the one. That's what you've got to do. It's fascinating and interesting. And I give him a lot of credit for that. But then almost unbelievably, Penguin turned down the manuscript, turned down the proposal, and rejected it. So I had no publisher. I had an idea, and I was getting more and more into it because it was a curious blend of, family story, personal, but also things I was interested in, genocide and crimes against humanity, and was doing cases on. So they turned it down. Stuart was sort of a little bit upset. I think it was people above him, although I don't know how much he really pushed it. And then, of course, it was incredibly ironic when 6 years later, at the Bailey Gifford evening ceremony thing, who gives out the prize but Stuart Prophet? And we've always got on well. We've stayed very close, and he's a wonderful editor. And to him, I express real appreciation for having chosen that book. It has completely changed my life. But it was an accident. There's no sense of my having had an intuition, there's a story here, there's something I want to write. And the way that I write, it's a bit like a case. You just start and you follow your nose. You just head off. And it's completely unexpected what I discovered. I had no idea what I was going to discover.
I suspect when he was on that podium with the award, he was feeling a little regretful at not taking it on. Do you have a sense of why they passed on it? Do you think it was that kind of ambitious mix of history and personal memoir? Or
he said it was his boss, and I believe him. I think he's a straight shooter, that it just didn't feel right, or maybe I couldn't write, or I'm very, very thick-skinned. As a barrister, you learn to be incredibly thick-skinned because, you lose cases and you know that it's not personal and people have their views for things. So by then I had an agent. So that was a change. I mean, after Lawless World, that was a very big change. Jill Coleridge, who is a wonderful agent, pretty much retired now from Rogers and Coleridge with Deborah Rogers. She had set up her agency, and she said, "Don't worry, we'll find someone else." And we did. We found a wonderful editor. I mean, what actually happened was that it was bought in America. It was bought by Alfred Knopf, and my editor there, who is an utterly brilliant editor, Vicky Wilson, who's just retired in the last few months, said, "I will buy this book, but on two conditions." By now, I had a full text, 125,000 words, which I thought, ready to publish, ready to roll. And condition number one was you'll completely rewrite it. And condition number two was that I, Vicky, will be the only editor. You will not sell it to the United Kingdom until it's cooked. And so I worked with her for 4 years. Every time I did 5 different drafts of 140,000 words. They were all different. And the brilliance of her editing, as I had started it, I mean, essentially tells the story of 4 men, my grandfather and inventors of crimes against humanity and genocide and Adolf Hitler's lawyer. And so from 1914 to 1945, and I'd started the story with all 4 men in 1914. That was how I wrote it. And she said, "No, that's not going to work because readers are intelligent and they're willing to work hard, but you need to help them. So the first part will be one of the men up to the moment the Nuremberg trial starts. The second part will be a second, the third will be the third, and the fourth will be the fourth. And then once you get to Nuremberg, at that point, you can fuse the stories into a single narrative in which all 4 participate." That is utterly brilliant editing. And it's not my idea. It's not my decision. It's Vicky Wilson's decision. And to have the possibility of working with someone like that is really a remarkable thing.
How did the winning that prize change things? You mentioned it changed your life. And then we also noticed, so we have this rule on the podcast that we always ask about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. And we saw that you gave the money away. So tell us about, the experience of winning the prize and why you donated it to charity.
Well, I was up for the prize. We were 5 or 6, I think. I can't remember. And, you looked at those list of names and you just thought, oh, there's no way. I mean, I'm just going to have a great evening. It's just really nice to be shortlisted. I mean, it was just unimaginable that you could win such a thing when you've got, I don't know, Marilyn Robinson and Hisham Matar. So Hisham is a very close friend. So we went together. And on the way in, we agreed that if either of us won, we would give everything away to refugee organizations. I think in the end I chose 3 different organizations. And it may have been his idea, I can't remember. In his case, it was really a deeply generous thing because he is a full-time writer and is dependent on his income from writing in a complete sense. I mean, he now does teach part-time at Columbia University in New York, so it's changed a bit. But that was a huge thing. And I thought, well, if he's going to do that, I've got to be able to do that. I've been in a really fortunate position. I have a whole other life. I have an academic position. The salary's not huge, but it's something. And I work as a barrister, and we're very generously paid as barristers. So I've never needed to write for income. And I use my advances to basically, very largely, to cover the costs of the travel and the research assistance and everything that I need. I mean, I spent years writing these books. The one that I've just finished now, which is a sort of sequel to East West and the Rat Line, which is about Pinochet in London and a Nazi who ended up in Chile. I started that in 2015. So the first interview was 2015. And East West and the Rat Line was the same. So, I must be very careful how I say it. It was a very generous price. £30,000 is a lot of money. But we're a family who really cares about these kinds of things. We take all these decisions together as a family, wife, kids. We'll, what do we do with it? And so that has helped me, I think, not to be dependent on it. It was an utterly transformative moment. It's completely changed my life. You win a prize like that, and all of a sudden you get invitations from everywhere. One of the things that happens, I was thrilled that I think one foreign language edition had been signed by the time of the Baillie Gifford, which was sort of the autumn of 2016. And of course, immediately you get all these foreign translations. And I think East West Street's now in sort of 32 languages or something ridiculous. And that means you truly have a global audience. And that's because of Baillie Gifford. That would not have happened without Baillie Gifford. And so that then means you're on a completely different plane. I think even being shortlisted is transformative. And what happens next is the relationship between the different parts of your life, your teaching, your legal work, and your writing changes. And now the thing that I spend most time on is writing. And what I love doing the most is writing. I don't say it's the most important thing I do, but it's what I love doing the most.
Just to note briefly that Hisham is also a previous guest of the podcast, so he was fantastic.
Well, he's just spent, he and his wife and Juan Gabriel Vasquez, he's a wonderful Colombian writer, and his wife, we're very, very close friends as three couples, and we've just spent 5 days together just hanging out, and it's been absolutely wonderful. Wonderful. Of course, I think of them as real writers. I feel like I'm an interloper. I'm this like lawyer type who just writes on the side, but they're very generous in including me in their little group.
Even though you just said though that the writing is now your main priority, so maybe a cognitive shift is required.
Yeah, and that's changed. But I mean, here are two individuals, as with so many others, who have devoted themselves full time to writing. So I'm in a state of deep respect and awe for people who've made their lives around that. Coming back to your earlier question, in a sense, it's a burden that you don't have to do it full time, that you've got this other life, which in a certain sense means you can take more risks, but in another sense means you've never actually had to take any risks because the mortgage is paid, holidays are paid, whatever. You do a few cases of barrister, and you're fine. So it leaves a sense. I wouldn't say it's a sense of insecurity, but this sense of, gosh, am I really a writer? Am I an interloper? I'm in the company of all these people who have really devoted themselves. But no, I mean, when we hang out together, we spend a lot of time talking about how we structure our books and how things. And, Hisham wanted me to read the ending this morning over breakfast and how does it sound? And he has ideas and reactions and things. And I love that. And they treat me with warmth and friendship and amazing respect. I think they're fascinated by the legal side. I have this long-running conversation with Hisham where I just keep saying, "Oh, I've got to stop the law. I mean, I can't do this. Like, it's too much juggling. It's just too much." And he says, you just can't. The law nourishes you. Your stories nourish you. And you have to not sever that connection. And I think he's right. And I think it's wise advice.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bethany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
What is the role of being multilingual in your work? I listened to the Ratline podcast in French, which I really enjoyed, and also the Le Carré podcast. And has that been a factor, do you think? I mean, you're half French, but in how you write and in your approach to language?
Huge impact. And there I really have to thank my mum who made me speak French to her when I was a little boy, and I hated it because as a kid, you just want to be like everyone else. And, when your mum meets you outside school with this weird accent and speaks to you in French, it's really embarrassing and humiliating. But it turns out it was great because I was the only Brit who could work in English and in French completely, writing in French, speaking in French. And the two languages of international law are English and French. And so the Francophones, of course, gravitate to the poor Brit who actually can get by in French. And that was transformative in terms of my legal career, which I think has had a big impact on how I write and what I write. It also has a very big impact on what I read. I mean, I read a lot of novels. I read a lot of fiction as well as nonfiction, and I read it often in the original language in French. And it's enabled me also to intersect with the Francophone world of literature. And it's a very different world, as both of you will know. There is a reverence for the writer in the Francophone world that does not exist or is different than the Anglophone world. And that I noticed immediately when East West Street came out in French. With the Anglophone, and present company very obviously excluded, it was not unusual to be interviewed about your book by someone who hadn't read it and by someone who might give you 36 minutes for a conversation to whatever. You go into the Francophone world, and I kid you not, they have read it. Every word, they've marked it up, and they expect you to spend 6 or 7 hours with them talking about it and just passing every detail and why did you do this and why did you do that. And I sort of love it because it's very different from what I'm used to. It's not I have an Anglo-Saxon mind. I think like an Anglo-Saxon. I don't think like a Francophone. But I'm fascinated by the way the Francophone mind thinks about things, the Cartesian logic, and so I think it's enriched me in a very big way. It's made me very partial to literature in other languages. You'll feel that both in East West Street and in the Ratline, and particularly now in the new book about Pinochet, I've gone very deep in a slightly more literary way into the lives of two great writers, Bruce Chatwin and Roberto Bolaño. And I think the desire to understand someone like Bolaño comes from the fact that I can speak French. And so I can sort of get by in Spanish. My Spanish is pitiful, but I can read it and I can understand sort of. And it's opened my world to different cultures, to different ways of thinking, to different ways of writing. And I think that's benefited me greatly. And the books, France is a really big place for my books. They really engage, and it's in a very different way from coming back to The Last Colony. I think The Last Colony did better in France than it did in England because, of course, the Brits aren't so thrilled about one of their own, castigating them for their colonial policy. But as you can imagine, for the French to have found a Brit who's willing to be mean about British colonial history rather than Algeria or whatever, thrilled. I mean, there were full, profiles, reviews in every newspaper, in everything imaginable. And I don't, to be honest, think it's the quality of the writing or it's basically they found this Brit who's willing to put the boot into the Brits in a way that is vaguely literary. And they like that. So the question you've asked is a very important one. I think it's been very significant.
I suspect it's a bit of both. It's probably the quality of the writing and the opportunity to stick the boot in. You've mentioned The Rat Line, and you've also described East West Street, The Rat Line, and your forthcoming book as a kind of loose trilogy. How are you thinking of each part as contributing to a whole? And, in terms of voice and tone and things like that, how do they kind of fit together alongside the history?
I've thought about this question a lot. I mean, they're connected. There's a sort of passing of the baton. When I wrote East West Street, I thought nothing more is going to come. But as you'll know, because unlike some of the people I've just been a bit rude about, you've probably read it and you know what it's about. And so you'll know that, one of the main characters is Hans Frank, and he's got a mate called Otto Wächter. And Otto Wächter becomes the main character in The Rat Line. And so there's a continuation which readers really like, it turns out. I get a lot of correspondence and they're fascinated by that. So there's a very minor character in The Rat Line called Walter Ralph, who writes a letter to Otto Wächter from Damascus, which Wächter arrives in Rome. And they were obviously mates, comrades. And I became interested in Ralph. And Ralph, it turned out, was, a terrible Nazi who did terrible things and ended up in Chile. And I started thinking to myself, could there be a connection with one of the cases that I did, which was the Pinochet case? So I'm very obsessive, like, as a litigator. You get totally obsessive about things. Drives family, my wife, everyone crazy because you won't leave any stone unturned. And you have a litigator's hunch that there's a connection, but it basically takes 10 years to find the connection. And I've now found the connection. And so you do cases and you don't really realize all the connections, but I'd forgotten that Augusto Pinochet, when he was indicted by the Spanish judge Baltasar Garzon, it was for crimes against humanity and genocide. So there's a very substantive connection with East West Street. There's a character connection because Walter Ralph, is one degree of separation from Hans Frank. But the main part of your question is a fascinating one for me, which has the style and the tone changed? And I think the basic style is the same. I'm very restrained. I don't judge anyone. And that comes, I think, from being in court. You're very careful. You're respectful, even for people who do appalling things. But I've found my voice. This is the first one of the 3 books in which, when I sent it off on the 1st of July, it's done. There's no coming back, I should have done this, I should have done this. The page proofs are coming back now. And there's no sense of, gosh, this really doesn't work. Why did I do this? And I'm in a different place as a writer. And I've also consciously connected much more to the literary world, to Chatwin and to Bolaño. And the beating heart of the story is something which I'm very interested in as a lawyer, which is the fine line that is said to distinguish fact from fiction. How do myths get created? And how do we sort out the true from the false? And the beating heart of this new book is the question, did Walter Ralph work for Augusto Pinochet? And that is what I've spent 10 years trying to work out. And if you go to Chatwin and you go to Bolaño, both writers, almost unbelievably, deal with Walter Ralph. In Chatwin's In Patagonia, Ralph appears in chapter 95. The whole of chapter 95, very short, is devoted to Walter Ralph because he must come across his name in Punta Arenas. Two of Bolaño's books, Nights in Chile and Nazi Literature, deal with Walter Ralph. And so I became fascinated on why would these writers become so interested in Walter Ralph. And both are based on the myth that Ralph did terrible things in Chile, but did he? And in Chile, everyone knows the name Walter Ralph and everyone thinks he did terrible things. But actually, when you begin to scratch, a lot of it is based on a mythology, including a literary mythology. Bolaño has contributed to the belief that Ralph worked for Pinochet. Because if you've read Nights in Chile, that's essentially what he said. Ralph becomes the person who was responsible for teaching Pinochet all about Marxist theory, Gramsci, and so it's really utterly fascinating. And so how did Bolaño fall onto that? That's sort of what I want to know. So, I'm constantly chasing sort of avenues and paths and connections, and a lot of it leads to rabbit holes, but not everything. And that's the joy of writing these kinds of things. And what Vicky Wilson said to me, and it was brilliant editing advice, she said, Philippe, this was in Writing East-West Street, what you have to understand is readers are not only interested in what you found, they want to know how you found it. And that is utterly brilliant advice. And it's the one thing I keep at the forefront of my mind. It's fine to take people down rabbit holes if they understand they're on a journey with you. And you sort of hope that at the end of the day, you arrive at a place of arrival where there is actually something.
Just coming back briefly to John le Carré, we had Adam Sisman on the show. And do you feel that, the information that's come out post-mortem about his private life and particularly his sort of relationships, plural, with women, has that caused you to reassess, or was that something that you were aware of while he was alive?
Everyone who knew David knew that there was stuff, and that was just how he was, and he was of a particular world in a particular place. I mean, I have had a couple of sessions with Adam, very restrained, I have to say, in what I was willing to say. And I knew even from the first edition that he had a lot more, and they had a sort of deal. But I haven't read the new one, and I didn't read, there was one former girlfriend, I think, who has written. I sort of don't want to know. There is a sort of, he has a place in my life. He was incredibly generous to me. He was who he was. Do I need to know all this kind of stuff? Actually, not really. Do I think it's wrong to write about it? No. If people want to write about it, that's totally fine, and they should uncover it. Do we really need to know about it? I'm not so sure it adds to the sense of the human being, and so that's always useful. But I haven't really wanted to know, but I don't shy away from the truths of it. I mean, I think we all knew there was stuff going on, and that's who he was. And I suppose I'd take a sort of French attitude to it. Yeah, that's what people get up to, and if that's what people get up to, fine. That's or not fine. But or not fine in some cases. We're just living right now through just very, very close to us this appalling story, and I'm wondering actually whether to write something about it or not. I've just finished reading. I blurbed the wonderful new book by Emmanuel Carrère on V13, which is an extraordinary book, a really extraordinary book. And there's this trial going on in Avignon right now, which is not very far from where we are, of a man who drugged his wife for 20 years and just invited anyone by internet and social messaging to come in and have sex with her. She had no idea what was going on. I mean, they've now got 70, 80 different individuals who are behind it. It's literally unbelievable. But that is obviously not cool. And I don't put the Sisman Le Carré stuff in that category. But provided you don't cross certain lines, I think what people get up to is a matter for them.
The details of the Pellico case are extremely disturbing. Can we move on now to your work at English Pen? You were president for a while. What do those responsibilities involve?
I think, I mean, you're seen as a sort of a figurehead, but I think the real role is just to provide assistance to the incredible staff. I mean, Penn had gone through some difficulties, so it was really about entering a phase of stability and building the foundations going forward. And Penn is in England in a really good position now with a really fantastic staff, headed by Dan Gorman. And my role was very often, I'm not a freedom of expression lawyer, but I know a little bit about freedom of expression, sort of hand-holding on those issues and being wheeled out if issues came up that needed to be addressed, if there were sensitive issues. I think one of the things of having a barrister writer as the president was that people turned. I mean, you're sort of trained to deal with delicate and difficult situations in ways that leave everyone sort of feeling okay one way or another. And so quite a lot of it was that, and it was being a you're a figurehead. I had been on the board. That was a lot of work. Being president was not a lot of work. It was nice, and lots of people are very nice to you because they think you're powerful, but you're not. And it was being a figurehead and responding. And so when I think of your question, most of the time it was attending events and prize givings and various other things and being there to say a few words of welcome and warmth and wonderfulness about the organization or the recipient. But actually, the most important part of it would be fielding a phone call from someone on the staff. This issue's come up. How do you think we should handle it? What should we do? What should we say to the media? How should we deal with that? And there, in a sense, is your real work and your real worth, because there you can make a difference, I think, I hope. And some of the issues were incredibly delicate and required discretion, and barristers aren't good for much, but they are good at discretion and sort of sorting things out in a way that is not public and you think through and principled, one that is decent. I mean, a lot of freedom of expression is about balancing. It's about balancing the desire to express yourself while at the same time not crossing lines that are going to cause offense or difficulty to others, particularly if they are illegal, inciting violence or hate or this kind of stuff. And so that was what I really enjoyed doing. That's where I was happiest, where Dan or someone would call up and say, we've got this issue. What do you think? Can we just bounce an idea off you? And you're a sounding board. And that's a nice role to have.
On that relationship with freedom of expression and the law, was it during your tenure at Penn that this issue with Daphne Caruana Galizia came up, where it turned out that she had been threatened by a Mishcon lawyer who was on the board? And kind of more pursuant to that, what do you think of this thing, which I appreciate this is not your area of law, but with, it's happened more than once. It happened with Catherine Belton's books on Putin, that you would get a situation with like a London, freedom of the press lawyer who is making a public profile for themselves about, saying all the right things about freedom of expression and sitting on these boards. And it turns out that in parallel, at the same time, they're actively threatening reporters.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me just be careful. I'm not. I just want to be careful to say that I don't necessarily share your characterization of what happened.
Okay.
But it was the case that I think one of that lawyer's partners was involved at the same law firm on that issue. And I'm a very strong believer in dealing with conflicts of interest openly. And you should avoid putting yourself in a place of a conflict of interest. And the moment a reasonable person would say that's a conflict of interest, you withdraw, you do not continue, you avoid totally bringing an organization or an entity or a person into difficulty. So that kind of issue for me is about conflict, and that requires transparency and openness and being absolutely straight and not putting your own interests above the interests of the organization. So one of the jobs that I have is I sit as an arbitrator. I sit as it's a kind of judge. And the conflicts issue is really important in that context. And I take an approach in which I want to be absolutely squeaky clean on those kinds of issues. So I'm always going to come down on the side of erring on the cautious side. I mean, we've just had it. I've just had a sort of amazing summer where I was a judge at the Olympic Games on the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And one of the cases that we had involved a very famous American gymnast who lost her bronze medal. And there was an issue of conflicts has been raised in that context, where one of the fellow arbitrators had a relationship with the Romanian state. As you probably know, Romanian gymnasts were also involved. And in that case, the lawyer concerned made a full declaration and said, this is the situation. And no one reacted to say, you better step down. And in that context, in my book, generally, that deals with the problem. So transparency and openness is incredibly important. You have to give the person a chance to respond. In a sense, this is a very central part of the new book, the Pinochet book. You won't recall, but there was a very big issue about a judge who sat on the famous Pinochet case in November 1998, Lord Hoffman, who did not declare openly at the beginning of the hearings that he was also he was a director of an Amnesty International charity, and Amnesty International had intervened in the case. And so it became a huge drama. So I've had a series of issues in Penn, at the Hay Festival, where, and I'm not saying it's a personal quality to me, but because of my background as a barrister, where issues of transparency, integrity, independence, avoiding conflicts are so important in our lives, I'm the one who gets wheeled out to often help address these issues, which means I get a lot of opprobrium because, but in all cases, what I try to do is just apply the principles in a correct and a fair way. And that has consequences. I mean, I think it's helped me a lot in my writing to have the background of a barrister. I'm a huge fan of the English bar. I don't know whether you know barristers, have come across barristers, but the ethical standards are really the highest. They are really, really significant. And the independence, the impartiality means you step back. And I've written in my recent books about really sensitive issues, whether it's Chagos or genocide or Pinochet or whatever. And having had now 40 years of dealing with these ethical standards and taking them very seriously, it does enable you to navigate these kinds of issues. Well, I hope it helps you navigate these kinds of issues.
We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask a final question about the balance between your writing and your legal work. You mentioned earlier that the shift is kind of balancing towards the writing, and I wondered to what extent that was because of the popularity of your books and the projects that you want to pursue, or whether it comes from a kind of pessimism about the legal aspect. I mean, you've written a lot about the difficulties with the war in Russia and with Israel and Gaza. And I wonder if the decision to rebalance your working life comes from a positive thing or a pessimism about international law.
No, I think it's a positive thing. You will have picked up, I'm quite an optimistic person, and I'm optimistic about the law in the long run. I'm not optimistic in the immediate period. I mean, the world really is in a very bad state. The issue actually of those two issues you've mentioned are obviously very bad, but the worst one is climate change, and that really worries me. But I suppose somehow I hope we will muddle through on all of these issues, and golden plains and valleys will open up of wonderfulness, but they may not. No, I think it's that what happens is you reach a certain age I've been very fortunate in my legal life and have done all the kinds of cases I would like to do. There's not a lot of gaps where I'm thinking, gosh, I'd really love to do that. I don't want to be a judge. Um, and one of the beauties of writing is it's a very solitary life. No one rings up and says, oh, I need you to do a paper for me by tomorrow morning, which, I've just had yesterday where something comes up and someone wants, a prime minister of some country wants a 10-page paper by tomorrow morning, and you've got to do it as a barrister. So what I'm increasingly attracted to is a slower life and a life in which I'm just much more in charge of my own destiny. I wake up in the morning, I'm going to write 6 pages, I'm going to make myself a nice lunch, go for a run, go and have a wander, watch a movie, and not have someone ring up and say, you've got to do this really important thing for which we're going to pay you significant sums of money, so please have it on my desk by 9 a.m. It's a life choice. And also, there's another generation coming along, and I don't have any illusions. There's lots of people who can do what I do as a barrister, and that next generation will do a fantastic job. And you reach a certain age in your early 60s and you think, okay, so whatever time you've got left, what do I actually want to be doing? And I've realized what I really want to be doing is writing, that I really love. I'm happiest when I've got a writing project that I'm really into, and it completely takes me over. Writing a pleading is a bit like that, actually, to be honest. And if I get into a big case like Chagos or Pinochet, then obviously writing is glorious because you're writing arguments and advocacy. And it's wonderful. And it's not so different from writing a book. But it's that solitary existence, which can be nerve-wracking, which seems to have that possibility. Why would I pass on that at this stage of my life?
Well, look, Philippe, this has been a totally fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, and we wanted to thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast and wish you all the best of luck with Pinochet and Chatwin and all your other personages and projects going forward.
No, thank you very much indeed. It's been great. I'm very grateful to you for very, very good questions and very good preparation in the French style, one might say.
We'll take that.
Take it. It's wonderful.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Philippe Sands. He's not on social media, but The Last Colony is published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson.
Before we wrap up, we just wanted to say a big thank you to our latest supporter on Patreon, Alex Holder. Alex is a writer and she runs a bookshop in Lisbon called Salted Books. One of the shop's main aims is helping writers to write. It runs free writing hours. It has a whole section of books that encourages healthy writing practices, and it hosts writing courses. So thank you so much, Alex, for your support, and wish you and Salted Books all the very best.
Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway with the interview with Philippe?
I thought it was interesting, if maybe not that surprising, that the importance of simple, clear storytelling in international law has shaped his approach as a writer. I enjoyed hearing about the structural changes of East-West Street and how he disentangled those 4 narratives and then kind of brought them back together. And a kind of odd resonance with another episode in that David Mitchell talked about how he picks up other characters or minor characters from other books and then brings them to the foreground. And it kind of seems like a similar thing happens with Philippe Sands, only that the metaverse is awful people from the 20th century, a subject which obviously is not going to run out of material anytime soon. How about you?
Very much so. I mean, on Always Take Notes meta questions, I liked his tale of sort of sitting in the French garden with Hicham Matar, who is also a past guest on the show. I also thought the story of the kind of road to publication of East-West Street was fascinating. I was mentioning it actually to a publisher I ran into, and they were like, oh, I had no idea, extraordinary. And I also thought his discussion about what speaking French and being multilingual, the role that he plays there was fascinating. I particularly like the idea that, a French journalist would sort of move in with him for a period of time and then, write an enormously long, thoughtful feuilleton, which is sort of different to how we do things here. But he'd been someone we've been trying to get on the show really for quite a long time, so it was excellent to have. And these people who are like writer and, I think is interesting. So, we've had writer and academic, writer and lawyer as a first, so a good addition. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to and what have you been consuming culturally?
I have published my piece on cheesy Christmas films and why we love them so much, which obviously required many hours of watching said cheesy films. You know, there are worse assignments to have. And then it's really kind of just been getting ready for the end of the year, and tying up things and getting things ready to publish in advance. So yes, things like that. And in terms of things I've been consuming, I'm very belatedly getting to Sally Rooney's new book, Intermezzo, which I'm enjoying so far. Kind of very different stylistically to her previous stuff. And I've also returned to The Americans, which James and I abandoned in the last season, and I don't entirely know why. So we're determined to finally finish it, which is the story of undercover agents in America. So it's good fun. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that all plays out many years again after that finished. How about you?
I've very nearly finished my book, actually. I know I say this every time, but every time it's like a different step in the process. So I actually, unprecedentedly, touch wood, think I will be on time and possibly even more astonishingly on length, which is something I've never done before. There's been a lot of stuff is on the cutting room floor, but I think actually, because my publishers were like, we don't want to see anything until you have a manuscript, which I found quite intimidating, but I have actually hewn to that. So I wonder if this is a brave new world. I have been reading another biography of Ella Meyer, my kind of central character, by a French woman called Gwenelle Abolivier, which is fun. And I tried watching The Diplomat because I knew you were into it, but I felt it was a bit like, you know, I mean, this is not a novel observation for me, but these depictions of Britain by like big American streamers where like everyone has slightly too good teeth and like the weather is slightly too good and stuff like that. So I didn't get too far with that, but I've now been watching the Lincoln.
It gets better in season 2.
Okay.
I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
I think season 2 is a lot stronger than season 1.
Yeah, my girlfriend was saying I had to persist with it as well. And then I've been watching The Lincoln Lawyer, which I really love the Matthew McConaughey film of that. So, you know, I was wary of getting into it, but again, my other half suggested it. So I've watched a couple of episodes of that, which I did find enjoyable, actually. And I should also say, actually, that I read, this is a friend of mine is publishing a novel next year, Alex Starrett, called Drayton and Mackenzie. He asked me to fact check it, which I am in the middle of doing, but I'm actually really enjoying that and found it extremely propulsive. So that's a shameless plug, but something to add for 2025. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. We're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.